Namaste, everyone. It's really a great blessing and an honor to be invited here to deliver this very special Sri Aurobindo Memorial Lecture at an institution which is, in so many ways, deeply connected with the spirit and work of Sri Aurobindo. So I'm really grateful to the Center for Sri Aurobindo Studies, led by Professor Aparajita and started by Indrani Di. For me, she's Indrani Di. I've had the pleasure of being with her for some time. And all the dignitaries and professors and scholars who are gathered here. So, invoking the presence of the Divine Mother, let me share a few thoughts on how I have come to understand Sri Aurobindo's vision of a true national education. And Professor Aparajita also suggested that there is a great emphasis of studying the work that has been done by Sri Aurobindo before he moved to Pondicherry. Most of the Indians kind of know of Sri Aurobindo as the Mahayogi and Maharishi from Pondicherry, but there was a lot of contribution he made before making that transition to Pondicherry. So I'm going to focus mostly on the work that he did in the field of education and including, of course, social philosophy because it connects with education in his pre-Pondicherry phase. So let me begin with one of his key passages that actually appeared in a writing later on from Pondicherry in the Arya Journal. But it really fits into the topic of national education that we are exploring today. So he wrote, "We have for a long time, not only in education, but in almost all things in our whole national life, lost hold of the national spirit and idea, and there has been as yet no effort of clear, sound, and deep thinking or seeing, which would enable us to recover it, and therefore no clear agreement or even clear difference of opinion on what these essentials are. So, the first thing that is needed in his words is to make clear to our own minds what the national spirit, temperament, idea, need demands of us through education and apply it in its right harmony to all the different elements of the problem. It sounds like as if he's just writing it today, though it was written in 1920, early 1921 actually. And it sounds that as if still we are struggling with what is the national, have we come to an agreement? What is the national spirit? What is the need of the hour to which our education and everything that we do in education should be applied to? And then he goes on to say, only after that is done, only after that understanding, that clarity is there in our own minds, we can really hope with some confidence and chance of utility and success to replace the present false, empty, and mechanical education. And again, it's so surprising. Till today, it feels many a times that our education has these things, that there is a mechanical feel to it, and it's mostly empty and it doesn't connect all of us with the deeper essence of life. So he really was keenly aware of what are the challenges in the kind of education that's been going on for the last more than 200 years in India. He had been observing that very closely from very early on in his writings. He had made note of what are the challenges in the education system, and he also had proposed and worked tangibly in that field. So, as I said, this passage, more than 100 years later, it still rings so true. And sadly, even after 77 years of India's independence, we are still unsure on a deeper level what is that national spirit or that national idea that our education should be addressing. Now, just as we are starting this brief exploration of Sri Aurobindo's vision for a true national education, let me point out one very important insight that we get from his various writings on education, which is the very idea of nation itself. How will we talk about national education when we don't have a clarity of what does the word nation mean? So there is a speech of his that he delivered in Maharashtra on 15th January 1908. And especially for the young scholars, I would recommend just go through that speech, because the kind of clarity he gives us as to what is the true essential meaning of a nation is quite remarkable. So there he speaks of the deeper Indian view of nation. He says our education mostly comes from the West, and even to understand the idea of nation, we have adopted Western definitions, Western lenses to understand what nation means. So he says, let us try to understand nation from an Indian lens. So, what is this deeper Indian view of nation? There he talks about that we have to look at the Indian view of what an individual is, and what is true of individual is also true of the collective, is also true of the samashti, the collective life. So he looks at nation just as we would understand a human being in three parts, which is from going from gross to subtle to causal. So these are the three bodies of nation that he speaks of. And because of the interest of in keeping things short in interest of time, I'm not going to elaborate on what these three constituents of a nation would be, but I would really recommend, especially the young scholars, trying to grasp the idea of what national sense means, or what does it mean to be an Indian. Go through what is the gross component of a nation, what is the subtle component of a nation, and what is the causal component of a nation. And then he says the picture doesn't end there, because there is always that fourth dimension, the spirit. And there is that spirit in a nation also. He later on in his social philosophy, which is another area of interest in Sri Aurobindo's larger work that I have, he develops that further when he speaks of nation ego and nation soul. So, by looking at nation in that way, he emphasizes that a nation is just like a human being, a living entity, a breathing, living entity full of consciousness. That is why it is so important to keep that livingness in mind when we think about what would be the right national education. So that's one very important insight we get from Sri Aurobindo's vision of Indian national education. Now, in 2020, we all know this national education policy that came about, came out, and there is a lot of talk that is there about how this gives us some hope in terms of Indianizing our education, and the centuries old Macaulay's burden that Indian education has been carrying would be a little eased as NEP tries to, the policy recommendations that have been there in NEP will be slowly implemented. But I have my own doubts, and I think, like most rational thinking people, we would say it's still in the policy stage. So we leave it to the time to decide how things actually, whether or not things actually change on the ground. But we have to move on to a more fundamental question here, which is the fact that should education be concerned about the future Indian nation? And that is another important insight we get from Sri Aurobindo. He was keenly cognizant of the fact that any national education worth uh, offering to students should be about building a new India, a future Indian nation. So, and then he talked about, I'll come to that point in a little bit, where he said just by adding Indian component will not make an education Indian in spirit. So he was concerned about how to make education Indian in spirit. So he said, I'll just read out his words: for our education will be truly national in spirit when it is proper to the Indian soul and need and temperament and culture. When he used to write like this with and in between, it was a way to emphasize each of these ideas. So Indian soul and need and temperament and culture that we are in quest of. So there is a sense of future movement there, not indeed something faithful merely to the past, but to the developing soul of India, to her future need, to the greatness of her coming self creation. So it's not just about glorifying the past, which is often the criticism that even he faced when he talked about, right from this land of Bengal, when he talked about national education, that is it about glorifying the ancient past of India? So he said that education cannot be truly national in spirit, which only looks at past. But if it forgets to look at past, that also is not national in spirit. So past, present, and future. I think only a yogi can speak like that, where all the, because it's a continuum of time. So then he goes on to talk about what is truly needed for creating or building an education that is truly national in spirit, which is concerned about the future of India, the future nation of India. There he talks about as if it's like, going back to basics. So he talks about three things again. This is why I think, and I'm sure many people from the audience who read Sri Aurobindo would also agree that um, when we start reading him more closely and carefully, we find how systematic he is. And in fact, it's like, you can write down on the margin of the book, point number 1, 2, 3, how organized. That's like a philosopher, how he would build his argument. So in this context also, he speaks of three things that must be kept into account when designing an education that is truly national in spirit. So, what are these three things that he says that must be taken into account in a true and living education? Number one, man, the individual. When he uses the word man, he is not talking about gendered man or woman. He's talking about man, the mental being, which comes from the word Sanskrit word manas, the mental capacity. So that is number one, the individual in his commonness and in his uniqueness. Both, nothing is left behind. Number two, the nation or the people to which he belongs. And number three, the universal humanity. And there is obviously a gradation, a hierarchy there. So, individual, the nation or people to which he or she belongs, and the universal humanity. It follows that that alone will be a true and living education which helps to bring out to full advantage, makes ready for the full purpose and scope of human life, all that is in the individual man. So the all round development of the being, the individual, um, which at the same time, by ensuring that an individual is fully integrated and has the all rounded development, he or she will be ready to be part of the second level, which is the nation. That to give, to be able to contribute to the life of the collective to which he or she belongs, which is the life and mind of the nation. That's number two. And ultimately, by developing that, he or she, along with the nation, they will be able to contribute to the universal life of humanity, the world. So nothing is left out in his vision of national education. It is not at all confined to a chauvinistic understanding of nation, but rather nation as a living unit of the larger um, collective, which is the world, the universal humanity. So that in his vision is true and living education. So these three significant units. And I think this seems like a simple point, but this is a crux. This is the crux of the thing, because this is in line with Indian vision of looking at life, where individual is not a separate from the collective life. And the collective life does not end with nation as the ultimate synthesis. Nation is a stepping stone to a larger synthesis of world. Right? So that is a very important aspect of this vision of national education. So, and I happen to think that only when we as individuals know truly, in a sense, who we are, what we are made of, the various components that bring a harmony within us, we can not only contribute effectively and efficiently to the national life and become more creative and conscious citizens of India, but also we are ready to move on to higher, which is the life of the world. So it's really important. That's why when education, later on when he talks about education's main purpose is, which is again in aligned with Indian philosophical vision of Atmanam Vidhi, know thyself and conquer thyself. It starts from there, but it ends with the life of the humanity. Um, so So these are two things that I have shown so far at this point. Let me go back to another point that we have in, because I want to make it relevant to the times that we are living in, which is the National Education Policy 2020. And there has been some talk about how many of the insights that we find in national education policy documented may have been taken from the educational vision of Sri Aurobindo. In some ways it is true, but in many ways it's not. For example, one of the major things that is missing in national education policy is the idea of that all these physical, vital, which is the emotional, mental parts of the being have to be given all round development. But there is something deeper than that, the spirit that is part of Sri Aurobindo's vision of a national education is totally left out. How to address that part? So that is something that I think India has a long way to go to address that part. But when we come to understanding education, the first thing, which is that to know oneself, we have to start with how in India we have looked at not who an individual is, but what an individual is. Because the moment we say who an individual is, it is as if, like, we are talking about the outer identity, gender, ethnicity, language, culture, things like that. But when we talk about what an individual is, that's where the Indian darshan, the Indian vision speaks of that an individual is first and foremost a spirit, a portion of the divine that is enwrapped in formations of the nature, which is the physical, the vital part, the emotional part, the heart center, and the mental, the intellect, the intellectual part. So the core is still a portion of the divine that is enwrapped. That's how Sri Aurobindo speaks of that an individual self. I'll just read his words. First and foremost, a portion of the divinity enwrapped in mind and body, a conscious manifestation in nature, Prakriti, of the universal spirit. So this part is not fully addressed because my guess is they don't know how to address this part. How can education address that part? And Sri Aurobindo has answers to that as well. We'll come to that in a little bit. So I'm just, in the interest of time, I'm keep going through some of these notes. So one of the first things education must do, and this is again drawing from Sri Aurobindo's insights into national education, education must facilitate this kind of a deeper inquiry into the essence of an individual. And later on, it would be developed along with his spiritual collaborator, Mira Alfasa, the mother, as integral education, where the word that is used is called psychic education. But the hints of that we find much before in Sri Aurobindo's earlier writings, right from Baroda onwards. In fact, even, from Baroda period onwards itself. So in addition to facilitating a strong sense of outer identity, where the physical, the emotional, the intellectual parts of the being will be addressed, education must also help learners cultivate an awareness that there is something beyond all this, something behind all this, which is the basis on which these multiple identities can be harmonized. So, beyond gender, ethnicity, nationality, creed, what is that one element which has the potential for us to see me in you? That is the key, because that's where the unity would come in, national unity and world unity. So that part is important. um, so in fact, if you start going through Sri Aurobindo's writings from Bande Mataram, Karma Yogin, or even before that, Indu Prakash. In Indu Prakash, he had written some essays looking at the life and work of Bankim Chandra Chatterjee. These are supposed to be literary essays, but there are gems of insights into critiquing the Western education, the British education that was in vogue at that time. And even after independence, as I said, we just sort of continued with that Macaulayan system of education, just changing few things here and there, more like cosmetic changes. Um, but one of the things he mentions there is the fact that Bankim did not go through many of those British systems of education, and he chose to study in the traditional, conventional Sanskrit institutions. He was protected from the corrupting influence, which kept his originality alive, which made Bankim Bankim, so he could create those literary masterpieces. So these are very interesting essays to read, of course, from literary point of view also, and also from his critique on education of that time. And you will be surprised how timely it feels, as if he's criticizing today's mainstream education. Now, let me just go back to the history a little bit more as to how Sri Aurobindo came up with his vision for national education. So I'm going to just read some notes that I had prepared, because it's a long history, so I had to summarize it in a very brief note. So Sri Aurobindo's vision for India's national education was formulated as an important part of his integral vision of Purna Swaraj. Now, we often forget he was the first one to ask for complete independence, Purna Swaraj, complete self-rule for India. He was the first revolutionary to advocate for an economic, national, educational, judicial, and administrative boycott as a tactic to fight the colonial rule. He laid down clear and specific guidelines for setting up Swadeshi, a national education system, a system of national arbitration courts, and a national organization for self-government. And details of these are all there in pages of Bande Mataram, which is volume number 6 and 7 of his complete works. An in-depth examination of the historical context in which Sri Aurobindo brought forth his vision for national education is certainly beyond the scope of this limited lecture. But let me just mention quickly that the early 19th century in India saw much discourse and debate on educational reform. So he was not the only voice. He was probably the most comprehensive voice and most articulate voice, but things had been heating up for a while before that as well, and alongside him. There was much discourse and advocacy going on and debate on topics such as educational reform, including advocacy for Indian control on educational and national education that is rooted in Indian cultural ethos, use of mother tongue in classroom. It all feels so contemporarily relevant, as if the debates are still going on, and various other aspects. Several key names that emerged from this very land of Bengal, who strongly attacked the then existing system of colonial education, include Satish Chandra Mukherjee, to whom he actually gave the principalship of Bengal National College once when he decided to plunge deeply into politics, Rabindranath Tagore, with the starting of Shantiniketan, and Brahmabandham Upadhyay. But prior to that, even Arya Samaj, led by Swami Dayanand Saraswati, in the 1880s, had also been working and strongly advocating in the field of education as a precursor to a greater national awakening. So, again, the purpose of education for a national rebuilding, national reawakening was very much they were very cognizant of that, very aware of that. And one of the things Swami Dayanand Saraswati led quite strongly was equal education for boys and girls. So institutions were set up for boys and girls, full-fledged, all kinds of things. Again, something that we would find in Sri Aurobindo's insights on national education also. So, as I said, Sri Aurobindo first started observing the ill effects of the British system of education, even while doing the literary work, critique of Bankim Chandra Chatterjee. But then his own work as a teacher in Baroda was a great time for him to observe very closely and very carefully what wasn't working. So let me just share a few insights from that period to speak about how his vision for national education developed. Because there he was not only working with students as a teacher, as a professor of English and French, he also served as chairman of Baroda College Union and Debating Society, which gave him a lot of opportunities to observe very closely and work with the students on cultivating intellectual rigor. And he himself served as a very important example, because there are accounts of his students, who saw him devoting hours of his day in studying. So, for a student to see a teacher devoting so many hours in deepening his or her learning, served as a great example that how intellectual rigor can be cultivated, can be encouraged. Um, and there is one particular address that he gave in Baroda on 22nd July 1899 that is worth looking at. And this was done at college social gathering. Some of you may know, or those who don't know, but the Faculty of Arts at current Maharaja Sayajirao University in Baroda is where he used to teach, in the Faculty of Arts. I mean, now it is called Faculty of Arts. It was the Baroda College at that time. So he was teaching French and English there. So in that address delivered on 22nd July 1899, he so amazingly, beautifully highlighted how a well-conceived education, especially at the college and university level, can facilitate an all-round personality development. And he talked about how institutions in the US, because he studied for 14 years at England, and he talked about how certain institutions in UK were able to cultivate a lifelong sense of reverence in the students for their institutions, which is sorely lacking in India. At that time, it was lacking, and if we are honest, it is lacking even today. We don't feel that kind of reverence for our alma mater, because we don't feel that we got what we should have gotten. That is the sad state of affairs, but that is the bitter pill we have to take. So he emphasized on one very important point, something that will go on to become a very cardinal principle of his educational vision later on. This was in 1899, he said, that education does not stop after one finishes or receives the college or university degree, but what we should do is we should start looking at university education as an important preparation for life, where each individual must constantly strive for, and these are his words, for eminence and greatness. So, education should be such that will make us aspire for eminence and greatness. And it should be seen as a preparation for life in whatever chosen line of work that we want to pursue, whether it is in academics itself, whether it is in engineering, whether it is business, artist, whatever line of work that we may choose. But education should help us should encourage us to aspire for that eminence and greatness. Again, still keeping our focus in that historical understanding of Sri Aurobindo's developing vision. I'm still in Baroda in 1902. There is another important writing of his. It is sadly incomplete, but it's a great piece of his writing which gives us clues to his developing vision of national education. He, in that writing, pointed out on what he called as, his quotes, a fundamental and deplorable error in the prevailing education system. And when I read this, you will see how it may be still true to a very large extent in our mainstream higher education. So I'm focusing more on higher education. That's the context in which we are. He said, we have confused education with the acquisition of knowledge. Error number one. Education is not same as acquisition of knowledge. And the other confusion that we have created, we have interpreted knowledge itself in a very narrow and illiberal sense. So what would be the true liberal education? He will go on to define much later in another piece of writing. But the picture that he paints, I'm just going to read it out and see if you feel this is still true to a very large extent in our mainstream education, higher education. So he was a poet, so he would paint a picture. He would write like this: to give the student knowledge is necessary, but it is still more necessary to build up in him the power of using his knowledge. It would hardly be a good technical education for a carpenter to be taught how to fell trees so as to provide himself with wood, and never to learn how to prepare tables, chairs, and cabinets. What would the carpenter do with that knowledge who only knows how to cut the trees and who doesn't know what to do with the trees, how to convert trees, the wood, into tables, chairs, and cabinets, or even what tools are necessary for his craft? Yet, this is precisely what our system of education does. It trains the memory and provides the student with a storeroom of facts and second-hand ideas. Mug up the ideas, reproduce them in the exam paper. So it trains the storage faculty. The memory is the woodcutter's axe with which the woodcutter is cutting down trees. That is what memory does. And the storeroom that he acquires is the pile of wood that he has cut down in his course of tree felling. When he has done this, the university says to him, "We now declare you a bachelor of carpentry. We have given you a good and sharp axe, the memory with which to cut down the trees, and a fair nucleus of wood to begin with. Go on, my son, the world is full of forests, and provided the forest officer agrees, does not object, you can cut down as many trees and provide yourself with wood to your heart's content." Now the student goes forth, thus equipped. He may become a great timber merchant, but unless he is an exceptional genius, he will never be even a moderate carpenter. Right? So we have only helped the student develop the axe, use the axe, which is the memory, and the ability to cut down trees with that memory, but never given them the power to use that wood to convert it into tables, chairs, and the work that is actually a carpenter would do. So then he goes on to, takes that example, and then he builds on his argument that in addition to the memory, memory is a passive mental faculty. What education must do, a good national education which must build citizens for the future nation, must encourage cultivation of what he calls as 3 active mental faculties. What are these 3 active mental faculties? He calls them great manipulating faculties. But here the word manipulation is in the right sense of the term. And these faculties are, number 1, the power of reasoning. Number 2, the power of comparison and differentiation, to be able to discern, to be able to differentiate. And third, the power of expression. Unless these 3 active manipulating faculties are not developed, education does not really help develop the mind of the student. Forget the spirit or the soul. Those things are probably even beyond this. But even from a mental education perspective, if the education only focuses on memory, it's not doing its job. So this is something he wrote in 1902, and later on in one of his essays in Karma Yoga around 1910, we find this idea developed much further. So see, his uh, vision is emerging and evolving like that. Most of you may already be familiar with his three cardinal principles of true education or true teaching that he says. One is nothing can be taught. Second is the mind of the learner must be consulted in its own growth. And third is from near to far. So we begin to see the beginnings of these three principles of true teaching that he develops later on, right in his early writings, especially when he talks about that an educator's work is not to impart knowledge to the student, but to prepare the mind of the student so that the mind itself will not only discover, but like I said, use these great manipulating faculties to grow in knowledge, right? So he talked about how the development of intellect or buddhi must be the higher concern of, or the biggest concern of a good mental education. And there is one other essay of Sri Aurobindo written in 1910, which is titled National Value of Art. But the first or the second part of the essay, it's a 6-part essay. Um, the second part or the first two parts focus more or less on his understanding, his description of what is the nature of mind. And he was, I'm pretty sure, the first person to talk about what Western science discovered at least decades later, the right and the left hemispheres of the brain and the different faculties that are native to these two hemispheres of the brain. So it's something very important for an educationist to understand how education must encourage, must cultivate the development of both sides of the brain. So I'll just read out few passages, maybe just a small passage from that essay where he describes how the human brain, the two sides of the brain, what kind of faculties are if related to or connected to these two parts of the brain. So the right brain, which we call today as right brain, it's the comprehensive, creative, and synthetic, integrative part of the right hand faculty of the brain. And the left hand is associated with the more critical, analytic faculties. So then he goes on to explain to the right hand, that is the right hemisphere of the brain, belong judgment, imagination, memory, observation. To the left hand, comparison and reasoning. The critical faculties distinguish, which is the left brain, distinguish, compare, classify, generalize, deduce, infer, conclude. They are the component parts of the logical reason. So that's the logical faculty. The right hand faculties, on the other hand, comprehend, command, judge in their own right, grasp, hold, and manipulate. Now, this is interesting. The right hand mind is the master of knowledge, the left hand, its servant. So, reason is the servant of a more comprehensive faculty. The left hand touches only the body of knowledge, the right hand penetrates its soul. The left hand limits itself to ascertained truth, which has been ascertained, proved. The right hand grasps that which is still elusive or unascertained. It tries to probe further. It tries to go into the soul of knowledge. Both, this is key, both are essential to the completeness of the human reason. These important functions of the machine that is brain, have all to be raised to their highest and finest working power if the education of the child is not to be imperfect and one-sided. He was saying this in an essay titled National Value of Art. Why? To make a case how arts education must be critical, an important component of good education. Not just mathematics and science, or technical subjects or languages, but how and why arts are important and necessary. So, um, Western science really came much later to this conclusion that there are two kinds of faculties that we must need to develop. This is really radical, coming out in 1910. So that's again another reading that anybody who is interested in education must spend time really reflecting on that. So, why this sound preparation of mind was so important to Sri Aurobindo's vision? It is because he talked about how mind is the intermediary between the ordinary life, the outer life, and the inner, the life of the spirit that we must live. To grow in spirit, mind is the intermediary. So, good development of mind is important. Only then mind becomes open and receptive to higher visions, to higher illumined ideas coming from higher planes of consciousness. Mind that is not developed fully will not open itself so easily to illumination and inspiration coming from higher regions. So that's something again much later today in education, in progressive education, we speak of the necessity for full all round development of the mind so that mind understands its own limits and be open to higher inspirations. But again, Sri Aurobindo was talking in early 1900s about that. There is another series of essays that he wrote, which he titled The Brain of India, where again, when he was still in Bengal, he was writing about this. And there he emphasized the idea of that to truly help prepare the mind so that it becomes a more refined instrument and developed instrument of the soul, an educator must be able to, and there are great practical tips in that essay. An educator must be able to awaken in the learner an interest in the subject that is being explored. It's not same as making the subject interesting by adding fun activities, but to awaken in the learner an interest in whatever it is that is being explored. There he talked about how important it is for the students to develop or educators to help students develop faculties of proper observation. He gives very specific examples, like when you, especially in a child, when you are helping to develop the sense of observation. So there is a flower or this water bottle. How would you ask the child to look at this water bottle and observe it closely, and maybe observe it again the second day and make a drawing of it to develop the senses like that? Precise recording, good memory. Memory is important, but that's not the end of it all. An educator must also encourage imagination, because imagination is what helps develop the creative mental faculty. There he also talked about the need for developing power of concentration and for purification of nadis, chitta shuddhi. And he talked specifically about incorporating certain pranayama at the start of the classroom. So again, very full of practical advice, that practical tips that he gives to make education much more comprehensive and all-rounded. He also stressed on the importance of introducing a variety of topics, because there was always a reason why make education, this would be a true liberal education, which would expose students to a variety of subject areas. Why? Because it increases the suppleness of mind. When you can address something from various perspectives, it removes the mental rigidity. And also, same topic should be explored from a variety of perspectives. Later on, he would talk about how this idea of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis should be applied in a classroom. So, present one side of the whatever the topic is, present to the students or ask students to develop or to give a totally opposite side of that, from it, which would be the antithesis, and then encourage them to come to a synthesis, which is how you would grow higher in understanding. So again, that's an essay, The Brain of India, is a marvelous piece of his writing where he develops his vision for good mental education as part of his national education vision. So as I keep reminding that these are ideas that seem today that we would all agree on, because progressive thought in education has already accepted it. But to talk about these things in early 1900s, he was a pioneer in bringing out these aspects of mental education. Now, one point that I said in the beginning, which I'll take few more minutes to elaborate now, is what would make all of this truly an Indian national education. Now, as I said, Sri Aurobindo was very clear that just by just adding a little bit of tidbits of Indian content into education is not going to make education truly Indian or national in spirit. So, what would be required? For that, he will again take us back to the basics, and he would ask certain questions. And let me read out the questions that he posed and then he addressed. But before I do that, let me also share one other passage from him, how futuristic his vision is. And I still use the word futuristic because we are not there yet. It is still a futuristic vision for us. At that time, he was writing, it is not 18th century India. He was writing in 19th century, but he said it's not 18th century India, the India which by its moral and intellectual deficiencies gave itself into the keeping of foreigners, that we have to revive. National education is not about reviving that morally and intellectually deficient time period in Indian history where we gave ourselves to foreigners. But what we have to do is we have to look at the spirit, the ideals of that ancient and mightier India in a yet bring it in a yet more effective form and with a more modern organization. So he really wants us to go way deep in the past and look at what made India of that time, which was strong, mighty, self-reliant. Now, this is important. Why? Because there is, especially in the university context today, there is a great movement of incorporating IKS, Indian Knowledge Systems, into the university curriculum. But as Sri Aurobindo would caution us, just by adding tidbits of that is not going to make it our education nationalistic or Indian in spirit. So what we have to do is we have to look at what made education of the past so great. So these are the questions he posed for himself as a researcher, as a scholar, as a writer, and these questions are still relevant today. He asked these questions. We have to find out what was the secret of that gigantic intellectuality, spirituality, and superhuman moral force which we see pulsating in the Ramayana, in the Mahabharata, in ancient philosophy, in the supreme poetry, art, sculpture, and architecture of India. You travel throughout India, you will see all this scattered around. What made it possible? Right? There must have been something in the education that made this possible. What was at the basis of incomparable public works and engineering achievements? You travel through Karnataka, you will find sculpture pillars in temples which could not have been made without modern machinery, and still they are standing. They are made in 11th century, 10th century. How did that happen? There is a dam in Tamil Nadu which is still standing. How did that happen? Right? The opulent and exquisite industries, the great textile, we still see remnants of 700, 800-year-old textiles today. The great triumphs of science, scholarship, jurisprudence, logic, metaphysics, the unique social structure. How did they do it? Without a solid education system. What supported the heroism, the self abandonment of the Kshatriya, the Sikh, the Rajput, the unconquerable national vitality and endurance? What was it that stood behind the civilization, which was second to none in its massiveness of its outlines and the perfections of its details? Unless we ask these questions, we will not know the answer. Sri Aurobindo is generous, he will give us the answer. And from that answer, we have to find out what will truly make our education national and Indian in spirit. And then he says it would be an error to look for the secret of this success in the details of the instruction that was given in the old ashramas and gurukulas and universities. We must know what was the principle and basis on which the details were founded. Go back to the principles, the first principle, as the modern language talks of. Go back to the first principles. Don't just bother about what was talked about in the classrooms, because that time and context will change. So go back to the principles on which instruction was given, on which education was founded. We shall find the secret of their success in a profound knowledge of human psychology and its subtle application to the methods of intellectual training and instruction. So, this is the key. What did they know of human psychology, which we seem to have forgotten? And then, not only forgotten, we have also not applied it in our education system. Now, he will give the answer to that first principle. He said the essential principle on which this grand intellectual superstructure was built was the fundamental basis or the ancient vision of true education of soul and mind, was the all-important discipline of brahmacharya. Now, what is this brahmacharya that was at the base of this giant intellectual superstructure? And this essay, this Brain of India, rest of it is an elaboration of what this principle of brahmacharya is all about. It's a discipline that he said which laid down a strong foundation for all the stupendous and rich intellectual activity that ancient India witnessed in all spheres, which I just gave few examples of: spiritual, intellectual, aesthetic, economic, jurisprudence, and everything. So in that analysis, that Brain of India 1909, see, the title also tells you how the brain functions. It's the brain of India. The brahmacharya, he described it as a discipline for mastering one's lower nature. This is the profound knowledge of human psychology, that we are made of two natures. There is a lower nature and a higher nature. A lower nature is always what is interested in petty ambitions, quick gratifications, petty goals, and it is also full of egoistic demands and desires and pulls and cravings. But there is also higher nature. Brahmacharya is the discipline that helps us to control and master our lower nature. This involves controlling one's desires on all levels: physical, emotional, mental, by developing a habit of detachment from the objects of desire. Brahmacharya is also understood as purity in thought, word, and deed. Yes, it includes celibacy and continence, but it is not mere bachelorhood. It includes control not only of the sexual desire or impulse, but also conscious restraint over all other senses in thought, word, and deed. Typically, we understand it only as deed. Let the mind desire whatever. Let's just not do it. But no, that is not going to help us gain full self-control. And without that, our intellectual development will always be suffering. So he said that is the principle. If we ignore this, we do not make our education truly national and Indian in spirit. This is, again, as I said, we are not ready as a nation to talk about these things at the mainstream education level, but smaller efforts are going on, which is how things always evolve. At least the Indian history is proof. We don't necessarily make changes through revolutions. We make changes through evolutionary processes. So he explained a great deal of the philosophical and psychological basis of this principle, or this discipline rather, of brahmacharya. And he talked about this, how our ancients thoroughly understood that why this works. He explained that also in that essay. Again, certainly for students, but anybody who is interested in education must meditate on this essay, where he talked about what is the basis of this brahmacharya discipline. And let me just read few more points from his essay. He says they understood that man was not separate from the universe. So it's all one energy, but only a homogeneous part of it. as a wave is part of an ocean. They knew that the entire world is pervaded through and through by an infinite energy, Shakti, which pours itself into every name and form. The clod, the plant, the insect, the animal, the man are in their phenomenal existence merely more or less efficient adharas or receptacles, base of this one energy that is floating all around. Right? That's the philosophical and the psychological basis of why brahmacharya can work and would work, because it is all about energy and it's all one energy. This implies that each individual is essentially a dynamo rather, into which waves of all pervading energy have been generated and stored. Not only that, they can be perpetually conserved, used up, and even replenished. So, if we are all part of this one giant ocean of energy, depending on how we develop our receptivity, we can grow in the energy. And another important point, what the ancients knew of, he talked about, is the processes by which we can increase this energy into our adhara. Adhara is the foundation, the base, right? So there are specific methods that the yogis have talked about, how to increase energy. And one of those things is the control of desire, the senses that are always looking outward, by withdrawing them within, conserving the energy to build up the storehouse of energy within. um, so there are specific process by which one can clear of obstructions. The nadi shuddhi pranayama is one important aspect of that, and which removes the obstructions from the channel of communication between oneself and universal energy. A continual improvement of these adhara, this foundation, the base that we are, an increase in quantity and complexity of action and of the informing energy is the whole aim of evolution. So this helps us understand that the energy which is at the basis of the operation of all intellectual activity is within ourselves. So our work is to be able to increase the storehouse of that energy and to put it into creative use. So not only that, it must be capable of greater expansion and richer use. The practice of brahmacharya, when it is understood in this proper psychological sense, is nothing but a system of energy management. So, brahmacharya as a system of human energy management is another important insight that Sri Aurobindo gives us when he talks about his vision of national education. So, unless we bring that back, we will not be able to make our education truly Indian in spirit. Now, today, the progressive education thought is all about allowing students to develop in full freedom. That's important. It is very necessary. And yet, there has to be cultivated in them a spirit of self discipline, so that this idea of brahmacharya, not necessarily in that same form, but in the spirit, can be cultivated in them to control, to gradually develop the habit of self discipline and self control. So, this is what in Sri Aurobindo's vision would make education truly Indian in that spirit. So, the practice of brahmacharya, in the same essay, he explains it's not about suppression, but it's rather about an elimination of an obsession with our lower nature. And he gives very practical tips again. For example, rigorous integration of sports in education, physical education, will take us away from an obsession with all kinds of other impulses and desires that arise in us. Incorporation of arts, integration of arts helps refine the vital, the emotional nature. That itself gives you a creative outlet which takes us away from our own lower impulses. So, these two things at least are taken up a little bit in the national education policy. But the reason behind that, unless we know that, we will not be able to implement it in the correct way in our high school and especially in our higher education. So that reason has to be spelled out, I believe, very carefully. Um, just one or two quick words and then I will close. As I mentioned, in addition to one of the big ways in which brahmacharya discipline can be cultivated in spirit is through integration of rigorous um, physical education and integration of that, not make it one or two period in a week, which is typically what schools do. In fact, you go through Mumbai, you will find schools where they don't even have playground anymore because of the lack of space. But especially like how it was applied later on in Pondicherry is, we know that in the ashram school, um, not even Sunday is an off day when it comes to physical education for the students. So even Sunday, they have to go to the physical education class. And it's not 1 hour, it's a good 3 hour session from 4 to 7 for anybody who's part of the ashram school. So these ideas are not just in theory that he was talking about, they later on got applied in the ashram system of education and other institutions which have been applying some of these ideas. Later on, it came to be known as integral education. Um, so that was physical education. The other thing I said about arts integration as a way to practice brahmacharya as a discipline of human energy management. And arts education, as I mentioned, the national value of art, he emphasized so much on how arts can be a way to not only help the learner grow in an all round holistic way, but how a future nation which is much more refined in its taste, in its aesthetic sensibility, in its delicacy and softness can be facilitated through proper integration of arts education. He said our focus should not be that everybody should become an artist. Our focus should be that everybody should have developed a sense of beauty, a good sense of color, a good sense of proportion, harmony. And he talked about that not all houses can be made into museum or art galleries. That's not possible, that's not needed. But even daily objects of life can be arranged in a harmonious way so that right from childhood, um, a child sees what is beautiful, develops a sense of what is proper proportion, what should be the right arrangement of a space. So, simple things can help us cultivate. He talked about why people, when they grow up, develop a sense of, there is always a need, innate need for beauty and harmony in each individual. Again, a very profound understanding of human psychology. Because it does not get developed often, only few among us grow up to become artists or painters or musicians. That need in us gets expressed through our obsession with crude and vulgar forms of art. So he talked about how there are stages. He actually talked about three kinds of functions that art can perform. One is aesthetic, but even in aesthetic, the first thing is to, the outer arrangement of things. Then slowly with going more inward, and finally the idea of art for chitta shuddhi, purification of the heart, purification of the even healing, even healing of emotional traumas can be done through art, and a lot of work is being done on that these days. So that again, remember these ideas he was talking about in 1909, 1910. Many of these ideas have now become mainstream in our educational understanding. So that was the first, the aesthetic function of art. He talked about the intellectual function of art, how art helps mind grow in its subtlety. When you look at a piece of painting, you just have to quickly grasp what the artist is trying to say. The artist's statement is not there, but you try to read the mind of the artist, right? So it helps mind grow in suppleness. That's an intellectual function of the art. There are many more. I'm cutting things short. And finally, the spiritual function of art. It's not about religiosity, it's about cultivating a sense of an awareness of something beyond. If not an awareness, at least an openness to explore what is unknown. It develops that. And the best part is he's saying art does not do this only for an individual. art can do this for a nation, which is where the education comes in. That how arts should be made an important aspect, important part of national education. That's why the essay was called The National Value of Art. And this morning I went to Indian Museum. You are in Kolkata, you have to go to Indian Museum, the largest museum. And my husband and I were kind of walking through that, and just at the end we saw a group of students. Actually, there were two or three groups of students from different schools and colleges, mostly schools, who were there. But one group of students, the teachers asked them to, they laid out this, like a black plastic thing on the ground in the central courtyard, and the students were sitting around and they were asked to draw something. um, and I was telling my husband that, I remember going to museums as school trips, but none of our teachers thought of doing this, that you are not just here to see beautiful paintings or sculptures, but also to see to let that expression come out of you. And so that's what we were discussing, how things have changed. So the idea of understanding that, how art is an important part of education. And then we also talked about, these were maybe 25, 30 students. So it was easier. Maybe they've selected students who would be interested in doing that. But again, to make that effort, to make that possibility is a good step. So arts, national value of art, in his vision of national education, arts would play an important part for vital purification, for building a new nation that is more cultivated in its taste and less prone to crudeness and vulgarity. You see how many problems in society can be addressed if we have that, if we can take care of that. And finally, he would also talk about education of the heart, which he said is not same as education of the mind. And there he would talk about the idea of role of education for character development and transformation. When the question came up about integral yoga and what is unique about that, though the topic today is not going into that, but what is unique about integral yoga is the idea of transformation, and not just at the individual level, but at the collective level. So I'll just leave that part there, but connecting it to the idea of education or national education, Sri Aurobindo gave very practical tips, that he said no sermonizing will help in helping develop character. He used the phrase no sententious sermonizing, no moral preaching. He said this is a great error schools and colleges do when they introduce moral education classes. How do you cultivate good character development? How do you facilitate good character development? He used the word make it part of the daily satsang, daily conversations that teachers should have with the students. Make it part of a regular conversation. Why impose on anything artificially on that? He said, because what is not the need of the soul, it will not go in. Students will just listen to it and they'll say, okay, forget it. ये तो रोज का बात है, लेक्चर चलता रहता है मैम का या सर का. Not like that. He said, make it part of the daily satsang, daily conversations. He even talked about for younger kids and the older students. For the younger ones, he said, find beautiful stories that can work as role models for the children. Learn how to tell stories of great heroes and heroines from the past. So use those old techniques of storytelling that India is rich of, the storytelling traditions. Create those things. And these days, again, as I said, things are moving in the right direction. In some, at least in some spheres, there are people all over India who have made the art of storytelling into full-time profession. And I've had the opportunity to interview one who has been quite popular in Hyderabad area and many places. She uses all kinds of traditional Indian storytelling techniques to work with teachers and in teacher training programs, and to work with students to talk about beautiful things, life lessons, but through storytelling. And for the older students, he said, make right selection of books. Not necessarily. Even he said Ramayana, Mahabharata, our traditional texts can be used, but not as religious scriptures, but as stories of human interest, which is very interesting, because this is where so many debates about whether to incorporate Indian scriptures into education can end. When we look at them as religious texts, there are debates. When we look at them as stories of human interest and what humanity can learn from that, they have a very different lesson to give. So he talked about exploring that as a way to develop, cultivate character. So all parts of the being he addressed: mind, emotion, physical, as well as character, the emotion, the higher nature of the being. But all this has to be done with one objective in mind, that by cultivating these outer parts of the being, it's the inner evolving soul in us that is growing. If we leave that part out, education is not truly Indian in spirit. So do all this, but do it with the awareness that through this you are helping the evolving soul of the learner. He talked about child as a soul in evolution. That's the exact phrase he used. It's a child is not just a child, or a learner is not just a child. We all are technically souls in evolution. So all the outer development is to be done with the objective that the inner true being in us evolves and grows. With this awareness, we can make our education truly Indian in spirit. And let me close with one final speech that he gave right here in Bengal in 1907. He called it as an advice to, I hope I have the notes of that. Just let me quickly look through it. Yes, this was in the National College, advice to National College students. And this speech was given on 23rd August 1907. It was his farewell speech when he was leaving. Beautiful speech to read through, but few parts that I would like to emphasize, especially for the students and scholars at the back of the room. Like I said, it all comes in 2 pages. I'm just going to read 2 parts, 1 or 2 passages from there. Okay, when we established this college and left other occupations, other chances of life, no, this is not the part. Yes, to which I want you to read. What has been, this he's talking about himself and Satish Chandra Mukherjee, to whom he had given up the mantle to take up the National College work, which is now Jadavpur University. What has been insufficiently and imperfectly begun by us, it is for you, the students, the future, which would include not just the students, but the faculty, everybody, not just in this institution, but in all institutions, all of us. It is for you to complete and lead to perfection. When I come back, he said, I wish to see some of you becoming rich. Yes, education should help us become rich. I wish to see some of you becoming rich. But this is what is interesting. Rich not for yourselves, but that you may enrich the Mother India, with your riches. I wish to see some of you becoming great. Great not for your own sakes, not that you may satisfy your own vanity, but great for her, to make India great, to enable her to stand up with head erect among the nations of the earth, as she did in days of yore, in days of past, when the world looked up to her for light. Look at this. Even those who will remain poor and obscure, if you can't become mightily rich or mightily great, that's also fine. Even those who will remain poor and obscure, I want to see their very poverty and obscurity devoted to the motherland. There are times in a nation's history when providence places before it one work, one aim, to which everything else, however high and noble in itself, has to be sacrificed. Such a time has now arrived for our motherland. In 1907, it is true, we have to ask ourselves this question: whether in 2025 it rings true. However high and noble in self has to be sacrificed, such a time has now arrived for our motherland when nothing is dearer than her service. Do whatever you do for your own greatness, but do it for motherland service. Train yourselves. Yeah, if you will study, study for her sake. Train yourselves body, mind, and soul for her service. You will earn your living that you may live for her sake. You will go abroad for foreign lands that you may bring knowledge with which you may do service to her. Work that she may prosper. Suffer that she may rejoice. All is contained in that one single advice. Work so she may prosper, suffer so she may rejoice. So, any education which wants to be seen as national education, if it cannot cultivate this sense of serving the motherland through the riches, through the greatness, through the foreign education, foreign degrees, whatever we have acquired, is not truly national in spirit. So it's not so much about the content, but the spirit which will make an education truly Indian and truly national. This is the vision that Sri Aurobindo has given us for national education. And in some form or the other, it later on got applied in integral education in Ashram and many other institutions. So with that, I close my remarks, and I thank from the bottom of my heart for you all to be present and to indulge. And thank you so much.